So this is the Daily World Walk, episode 5. And I think we're going to take a diversion today because I am not feeling super inspired about the current story because I think we put a lot into it yesterday and I need more time to mull it over. And I think that's often the case. It's not that I'm not inspired, I guess. I misspoke already. That didn't take long. But as an author, my name is Tim, by the way. As an author, I find it's not always inspiration that's the problem. It's overinvestment or underinvestment. And the issue with doing a random world is that I get jostled around all the time by other media intake. So I say random, but one that I'm not thoroughly invested in, that I don't have a serious pull toward. And so therefore, especially with my other events this week and the other things I've been up to going on that I've been working the majority of my day on, it's been, I should say, I fell behind. Let's be honest here. I fell behind on fleshing out and making sense of what we have so far for the Sea of Tranquility. So that's a long way of saying I'm going to talk about some other stuff today. It'll still be related to world building because I find it very interesting, some of the world building I've been consuming lately, and mostly, honestly, it's related to war games and war stories currently, because I'm on a big Gundam, the Universal Century timeline kick. And so, because I recently watched the final movie of the original series, basically, Char's Counterattack. Char's Counterattack is the conclusion of about 150 episodes of anime, which is, it's a lot, even if they're only 20 minutes long each. And it's a good movie. It's solid as a part of the series and as a conclusion to the story of those characters. Though I know there's more timeline after that. There's shows to explore. It felt like a good place to stop for the moment and take stock of what I've already seen. And because, in case you aren't familiar, Gundam is military science fiction with giant robots, and the Gundams, of course, being the giant robots in some cases. But, of course, the more generic name for a robot in that series is a mobile suit. That's basically it. A mobile suit is the combat robot. And they're very large, and there's not a ton of explanation how you can have multiple 20-meter tall robots just made willy-nilly even over the course of decades, because they do get destroyed pretty fast in combat at times. But I guess that's what gets back to me, is that especially in the first two series, because the original show is split into 3 series: Mobile Suit Gundam, then Zeta Gundam, and then ZZ Gundam. So the first 2 series are my main focus here, because they're the ones that are kind of more main storyline, and the third one is it is still the main storyline, but it feels more like a departure in some ways, or it's not as important to the overall thrust of the narrative in certain ways. Or it's more thematic, I guess, than it is plot. Or, the continuation of the story feels a little diverted at that point. And then we get back to Char's Counterattack, which feels more like the first 2 shows. At least to me. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think the military science fiction side of Gundam is actually one of the most intriguing sides of it. Because it's a story that, again, first 2 shows, because these shows do have a different character, each of them does, really, have a very different character from the next one or the other, or the previous one. But in the original show and in Zeta Gundam, there's the idea that anyone can die in some stories. Well, Gundam isn't necessarily like that, because you can definitely, but you rarely feel the plot armor. It's well made in these cases. But the thing I find really cool about the world building, specifically in Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, which is the one I'm rewatching right now, is that there's so much attention to detail, and it really does convey very well in the animation. These are animated cartoons. And yet, when a robot moves, some thought was put into how it's able to move in that fashion. They vent air or use little side thrusters to move laterally. They have their big jetpacks to move in space. They can jump and walk and run and even go underwater sometimes. So there's a ton of options, I guess you might say, the way that concept has been delivered. And I personally think, I don't know this for sure, but I think the very idea, and maybe even the title of the original show, Mobile Suit Gundam, is based on the Gundam can fight basically anywhere. The robots can fight in practically any environment. And I think that's a huge part of the concept. Even though it's kind of unspoken, the action sequences in the show, in all the shows, really demonstrate, the level of variety of options for where these battles can take place. I think that's fantastic. There's also a lot of subtle world building, especially early on in Zeta Gundam, where they took some real risks with the storytelling by making the previous good guy faction, in air quotes, the Earth Federation, is the kind of the hero faction, the faction the side the heroes were on. In Mobile Suit Gundam, is revealed to have corrupt elements that are now basically the heels, to use the wrestling term, in Zeta Gundam. And even though eventually more, I guess, traditional, or like opponents more like the original Zeon come back in Zeta Gundam, it is kind of fascinating how they managed to expand the breadth of the show, right? You're just, okay, we're going to explore this setting more. We're going to explore this universe more. And it's great. It's very well done. There's flaws with Zeta Gundam, don't get me wrong. It's an older show. It's from 1986, I think. Maybe even earlier. But there's a lot of elements of it that I love. Like the fact that there's just subtle world building throughout. Like the fact that there are settlements on the moon, but also in space. But they all... And the communication methods seem fairly consistent. In this show, that's the other thing. I mean, even though they're quite primitive, basically. Because the show isn't theorizing any real advances in communications technology while do you use these mechs, or they theorize, things like interference to keep the mechs from communicating except by vocalization when you're touching another mech. But at least that's convenient most of the time, or not. That's consistent. Sorry, not convenient. It's pretty inconvenient to be in space fighting and you can't even communicate with the other mech pilots on your team. So anyway, Zeta Gundam, pretty good. Good world building, has lots of things like paid messaging systems and stuff. And like that you pay collect call kind of stuff, like the old phones on the long distance or whatever. And I mean, that's really interesting because it is in the future, but it's also like it's a retro future at this point, I guess, because I wouldn't imagine there will be a service where you pay by the call, right, in the near future. But maybe I'm wrong. But as a world-building piece, it feels reasonable. It feels like, that could exist in the future. It existed in the past. And yet, we don't really have it now. So, there's this tension, I guess, there for me, which isn't a bad thing. In fact, it makes the story feel compelling in certain ways. That a story that is just a Xerox of we're going to have what we have now, but with spaceships, isn't as compelling, right? So, that's I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a lot of, especially military science fiction made by independent authors like myself, though I don't write military science fiction, let's be honest. But I would like to. Unfortunately, a lot of the military sci-fi that's out there right now is written by, and this isn't the unfortunate part, but there's a lot of military veterans who read it, especially in the United States. Those people seem to want to see an exact reflection, a mirror of their experience that may or may not be reversed. So, what I'm saying is, they don't want to see organizations that function differently from the United States Marine Corps or Army or whatever. They want to see basically their organizations in the future, even if The story is explicitly not about that. And people can come... I've seen reviews. These reviews that friends of mine and people I know, other authors that I've read, and I think their books are good, but these big-time military SF fans are just all hypercritical about how accurate they are to a world that the author isn't even writing in, which I think is kind of wrong-headed. So, anyway, not to turn this into a wine fest, but I think that's an interesting issue to have, right? As a world builder, you not only have to make it clear that your story is diverging where it is divergent from the existing concepts you're playing with, especially in science fiction, right? Because in science fiction, a lot of the time we're nominally writing into the future. And so you have to make it has to make sense how you extrapolate to be that way. Like, for example, in Battlestar Galactica, I haven't seen the original show, but in the remake, people were still making fun of the Colonel character, Tig, I think his name was, who is a colonel, but is also the executive officer on a spaceship, where everyone else has naval ranks, or naval sounding ranks, like captains and so on, but or different kinds of officers, that I don't remember actually the other ranks, so maybe this isn't even a good example, but people wanted him to have a rank like, I don't know, lieutenant, executive officer. I don't know what they wanted from that. But he's not a ground commander, so people thought that was weird, at least in a lot of cases. I've seen memes about it. But the thing is, that story doesn't even take place in the future of Earth. It takes place somewhere else. It's kind of not really Star Wars-esque, but it's related to Earth, but not in the sense of being our direct future. So why does Colonel have to mean the same thing? Well, I'll tell you why. And actually, this is kind of the counter-argument is, why use that word if you don't mean that word, what that word means in our current day? And I actually think that's an interesting question, right? Because, there's no... I mean, we only have so many words, in some sense, that people recognize. Colonel would be one of those words in military science fiction. But the way language works, it's a little out of place, right? It's a ship in a ship situation, but the spaceship isn't a water ship either, so it's not on the water. Why would you have Marines on a spaceship? That doesn't make sense. You'd have spacers or whatever, spaces, or void troopers or whatever the hell you want to call them. So my point is, people are flexible about some stuff, but they're going to be fine holes to pick if they can detect any mistake that they perceive as a mistake, at least. What this really comes down to is is a term most writers are going to be familiar with, I think, by the midpoint of their training or learning, which is the willing suspension of disbelief. Right? So, it goes for any game or book or movie, but the audience has to bring something to the table. They bring their ability to suspend their disbelief, which means, just to forgive the stuff that's wild or weird or different than they might expect, or that they won't believe, specifically. So, I mean, a good example of that is stormtroopers in Star Wars. Why are they called stormtroopers? Never explained. But there are real units from our world that are called stormtroopers. And these Imperial stormtroopers in Star Wars don't have that much in common with them, because they're basically everybody in the Imperial Army appears to be that kind of character. Or at least all the infantry. But they're all called stormtroopers. They all wear the same armor, more or less. What's up with that? Never explained, never delved into. People don't have a problem with it, though, because they are... And I think my theory is because they are actually the Imperial forces, right? They're bad guys. They serve an empire. And that means people's word association is okay with that. They don't care about the details of the stormtroopers, a cool phrase. They don't care that they're not literally, from the World War II or World War I period. They're not for storming a trench, obviously, which I think is where the word originally comes from. World War I, going over the top, storming the enemy trench. And isn't that interesting, though? Isn't that interesting that Stormtrooper is fine, even though it meant something quite specific at one point, and continued meaning things that really don't imply the Imperial Stormtroopers in Star Wars. But Colonel in Battlestar Galactica gets people up their suspension of disbelief, and they're ready to cast it away because they think that's silly. Anyway, that's just an example of how some things, in this particular genre, right? Certain phrases carry more value than others. Certain terms have more, shall we say, latent value than others. But I don't think I have much else to say today. I'm tired. It's Friday. But I hope you have a good weekend. If you're listening to this on the day, of course. Or a good day, whatever day you're listening to this. Thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you later. On Monday, probably. Yeah, that's when the show comes back. Bye-bye.